November 1984. Federal Building, Lower Manhattan. Conference Room 4B. 11 men sit around a mahogany table. 10 of them are cooperating witnesses. One of them built an empire that the mafia couldn't touch, the NIPT couldn't stop, and the DIA couldn't understand. Frank Lucas watches them order lunch. Pastrami on rye. Chicken Caesar salad, Diet Coke with extra ice. These men, his former lieutenants, his blood relatives, his childhood friends, are placing their orders like this is a business meeting. Like they're not about to testify against the man who made them millionaires. The federal prosecutor thinks this is routine. 10 witnesses. 1 defendant. Case closed. He's wrong. Because Frank Lucas learned something 23 years ago from a dying man in a Harlem apartment, Bumpy Johnson taught him that, and right now, surrounded by rats with immunity deals and prosecutors with tape recorders, Frank is about to prove that the most dangerous man in any room isn't the one with the gun, it's the one who already made his choice before walking through the door. See, what the government doesn't know is simple. Frank had been expecting this moment since 1975, since the day they kicked down his door in Teaneck, New Jersey, and found $584,000 in cash hidden in his walls, since they arrested the man who smuggled 98% pure heroin through the coffins of dead American soldiers, since they captured the invisible king who generated $1 million in daily revenue while the Italian mafia was still collecting nickels. Frank glances at the man to his left, his cousin, the man who carried his first shipment of blue magic from the airport, the man who swore loyalty on his mother's grave. 3 weeks ago, that same man walked into this building and signed cooperation papers. Frank lifts his water glass. No ice, no lemon, just clarity. "You gentlemen ready to order?" asks the federal marshal, playing waiter in this theater of betrayal. Frank doesn't speak. He just watches. The way Tommy's hands shake when he reaches for the menu. The way Eddie won't make eye contact. The way his own brother keeps checking the door like backup might walk in. These aren't strangers. These are men who ate at his table. Men who drove his cars. Men who counted his money and kissed his children goodnight. And now they're here, ready to trade his throne for their freedom. The prosecutor slides a legal pad across the table. "Mr. Lucas, would you like to make a statement before we begin?" Frank looks at the 10 men. Then he looks at the prosecutor. Then he does something that will redefine everything you think you know about loyalty, betrayal, and the price of survival. He smiles. Because Frank Lucas didn't come here to be a victim. He came here to teach these 10 rats the difference between snitching down and snitching up. This is the untold story. The real story. The story of the man who let 10 snitches order dinner first, and then serve them their last meal. Harlem, 1966. Night presses against the windows of a small restaurant on 147th Street like a debt collector demanding payment. Inside the smoke-filled back room, 2 men sit at a table that reeks of power, whiskey, and secrets that could topple empires. One is a king, the other is a shadow learning to become a ghost. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson leans back in his chair, cigar smoke curling around his head like an invisible crown. The most feared man in Harlem doesn't need to raise his voice. His reputation does the shouting. Across from him, Frank Lucas stands with his hands clasped behind his back, still learning that drivers don't sit with kings. His suit is cheap, but clean. His shoes are polished, but worn. But his eyes are sharp, always counting, always calculating, always hungry. Bumpy taps ash into an overflowing tray and nods toward the front of the restaurant where a young dealer in a bright yellow suit laughs too loud, waves a fat roll of cash, and demands attention like applause is oxygen. "You see that boy out there?" Bumpy asks, his voice low and absolute. Frank glances through the cracked door. "Yeah, I see him." Bumpy's eyes turn cold as winter concrete. He's dead. The body's still breathing, but the man is finished. He just hasn't been buried yet. Frank frowns, not understanding. The kid looks very much alive, ordering drinks and posing for photographs. "Let me teach you something about power," Bumpy continues, leaning forward. "The silent man lives. The loud man dies. The street doesn't love noise. The street loves ghosts." This is Frank's education. Not in violence, but in invisibility. While other dealers drive Cadillacs and throw parties, Bumpy drives a modest Oldsmobile and eats at the same diner every Tuesday. He's built an empire by becoming impossible to see, impossible to prove, impossible to destroy. Because you cannot arrest what you cannot photograph. You cannot tax what you do not know exists. But Frank is young, 28 years old, with hunger burning hotter than patience. He sees Nicky Barnes on magazine covers wearing fur coats worth more than houses. He wants that recognition, that proof that he's somebody. Bumpy sees this hunger and calls it poison. "Every flashy gangster is a walking coffin," Bumpy explains. "The furs, the cars, the magazine covers, they're not trophies, they're tombstones." One winter night in 1967, Bumpy takes Frank to a warehouse in the Bronx. Inside are 50 kilos of heroin. The Italians sold it to Bumpy for $500,000. Bumpy will cut it, package it, and sell it for $800,000. A $300,000 profit sounds massive until Bumpy explains the mathematics of modern slavery. The Italians bought this same product from their suppliers in Marseille for $50,000, Bumpy says, his voice heavy with disgust. They marked it up 10 times before it even touched black hands. "We're not in the drug business, Frank. We're in the tax-paying business. The Italians control the source. Whoever controls the source controls the game. Everyone else is just renting power." Frank asks the obvious question, "Why don't you go to the source yourself?" Bumpy smiles, but it's tired, final. "Because I'm 70 years old and dying. But you're not." July 7th, 1968. Wells Restaurant on 145th Street. Bumpy Johnson collapses between the counter and the cash register, his heart finally surrendering after 7 decades of carrying Harlem on its shoulders. Frank catches him before he hits the floor, lowering the king gently as customers scream and dishes shatter around them. In those final moments, with sirens wailing in the distance and chaos erupting around them, Bumpy grabs Frank's collar and pulls him close. His last words are not sentimental. They're instructions. "Don't serve the throne," he whispers. "Take it." Then the king of Harlem is gone. The funeral becomes theater. Every gangster, dealer, and hustler in New York arrives to pay respects. But Frank notices what everyone else misses. The Italian bosses arrive in expensive cars, shake hands with Bumpy's widow, and leave within 10 minutes. They're not mourning. They're celebrating. With Bumpy dead, Harlem becomes open territory to be divided among their lieutenants, taxed by their system, controlled by their rules. Frank stands at the grave after everyone leaves, dirt fresh and flowers already wilting. He makes a decision that will either crown him or kill him. He's not going to fight the Italians for Harlem. He's not going to compete with other dealers for street corners. He's going to do what Bumpy taught him, go to the source. 3 weeks later, Frank Lucas boards a plane to Bangkok with $50,000 in cash and a one-way ticket into a war zone. The Vietnam conflict has created chaos in Southeast Asia, and chaos creates opportunity. The Golden Triangle is producing the purest heroin on Earth, while the world watches soldiers die instead of watching what's really being smuggled out of that jungle. The shadow is about to become a ghost. And ghosts don't just haunt, they rule from places the living cannot see. Bangkok, 1969. The air hangs thick as punishment, reeking of diesel fuel, jungle rot, and the sweat of a war America is losing one body bag at a time. Frank Lucas steps off a military transport plane wearing a conservative suit that makes him look like a government contractor, not a man hunting the source of an empire. Around him, young soldiers board planes heading to hell, while others return in flag-draped coffins. Frank watches the dead being loaded onto cargo trucks and sees what nobody else notices: perfect invisibility. 3 days later, deep in the Golden Triangle, Frank sits across from Luechi Rubiwat, a Chinese Thai warlord whose poppy fields stretch across the jungle like a narcotics kingdom. Between them on a bamboo table sits a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside is pharmaceutical-grade heroin, uncut, undiluted, 98% pure. Back in New York, the mafia's product averages 10% purity after being stepped on with quinine, lactose, and whatever else adds weight while stealing potency. The negotiation is mathematics wrapped in mortality. One wrong word means execution. One misunderstood gesture means a shallow jungle grave that will never be found. Rubiwat speaks through a translator, his words measured like bullets. The Corsicans pay $4,200 per kilo. You are unknown. Why should I trust you? Frank doesn't flinch. Bumpy taught him that confidence without arrogance opens doors that money alone cannot. Because the Corsicans sell to the Italians who sell to the blacks. I'm cutting out the middlemen. I'll pay $4,500 per kilo and buy 100 kilos monthly. But I need exclusivity and I need consistency. The translator relays this. Rubiwat's expression doesn't change, but his eyes sharpen. 100 kilos monthly means $450,000 in guaranteed revenue. More importantly, it means loyalty in a business built on betrayal. But the warlord asks the question that determines if Frank lives or dies: how will you move this product? The Americans watch everything. You are one black man with no connections. Explain how you will not be arrested before you leave Asia. Frank's answer is horrifying in its genius. He explains the cadaver connection. American soldiers are dying by the thousands in Vietnam. Their bodies return home in flag-draped coffins that nobody inspects because respect for the dead is the one sacred boundary even customs agents will not cross. Frank has identified a cousin, a sergeant who supervises the loading of bodies onto transport planes. 4. $25,000 per shipment. Certain coffins will have false bottoms. The heroin travels beneath the honored dead, invisible and untouchable. This is not just smuggling. This is weaponizing reverence. Rubiwat stares at Frank for 10 seconds that feel like 10 years. Then he smiles. Not from amusement, but from recognition. He's meeting someone who understands that the most effective hiding place is not darkness, but sanctity. The deal is struck. Frank returns to Harlem in late 1969, not as a street dealer, but as a CEO constructing a vertically integrated empire. He recruits his 15 brothers from North Carolina, blood relatives he can trust, in a business where trust is more valuable than cash. No outsiders. No partnerships, no loyalty questions, just family. The product hits Harlem streets in January 1970 under the brand name Blue Magic. It's 98% pure, packaged in blue glassine bags that become instantly recognizable. Frank sells it for half the mafia's price while making double their profit because he owns the entire supply chain. No middlemen, no taxes, no tributes to Italian bosses. Within 6 months, Blue Magic dominates the East Coast. Within a year, Frank generates $1 million daily. Within 2 years, his annual revenue exceeds $365 million. But nobody knows his name. While Nicky Barnes poses for magazine covers in chinchilla coats, Frank drives a modest Chevrolet and wears conservative Brooks Brothers suits. He has become what Bumpy taught him to be, a ghost generating wealth from shadows. The Italians notice their heroin profits collapsing, but cannot identify the cause. They interrogate dealers, threaten suppliers, and execute competitors, but Blue Magic's source remains invisible. Frank has built the perfect empire, untraceable, untouchable, and utterly dominant. But discipline is a muscle that weakens under the weight of success. In March 1971, Frank makes a decision that will haunt him forever. Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier, Madison Square Garden, the fight of the century. Frank decides to attend. But instead of his usual conservative suit, he wears a custom $50,000 chinchilla coat with a matching hat that makes him look like royalty. For one night, the Invisible Man chooses to be seen. Detective Richie Roberts sits 12 rows behind Frank, watching through binoculars, and takes a photograph. That single image becomes the thread that will unravel an empire built on silence. The ghost just became visible. And visibility is the beginning of every fall. By 1972, Frank Lucas doesn't just control Harlem's heroin trade. He commands a narcotic nation-state that stretches from Newark to Los Angeles, generating $1 million daily in pure profit. Blue Magic has become more than a brand. It's a revolution. The product's mathematical superiority is absolute. 98% purity at half the street price, while Frank maintains profit margins that would make Fortune 500 companies envious. His annual revenue approaches $365 million, but the most remarkable achievement isn't the money. It's the invisibility. Despite controlling the largest heroin operation on the East Coast, Frank Lucas remains a ghost generating wealth from shadows. The Italian mafia watches their empire crumble in real time. Their heroin profits have collapsed, 40% in 18 months. Their street dealers complain that addicts refuse their stepped-on garbage, demanding only the blue bags that appear on corners like clockwork but disappear into a supply chain no one can trace. This isn't competition. This is annihilation. In smoke-filled social clubs across Brooklyn and Queens, mafia captains study the mathematics of their destruction like generals losing a war they don't understand. They control the traditional French connection from Marseille. They own judges and police commissioners. They've ruled through violence for 3 decades. But someone is destroying them, and they don't even know who. The investigation begins with systematic brutality. They grab black dealers off Harlem corners, dragging them into basements for interrogations that break bones and shatter teeth. But every session ends the same way: confusion. The dealers aren't lying when they claim ignorance. Frank's operation is compartmentalized with surgical precision. Street dealers know only their runners. Runners know only lieutenants. Lieutenants know only one of Frank's 15 brothers. And the brothers answer only to Frank. Finally, they capture Ray, one of Frank's mid-level couriers, outside a stash house in Newark. In a Red Hook warehouse, they tie him to a chair and spend 6 hours asking questions with fists, pliers, and blowtorches. Ray screams. Ray begs. Ray offers to tell them everything. But here's the genius of Frank's architecture: Ray genuinely doesn't know anything. He knows pickup locations and delivery addresses, nothing more. Frank has built a machine where torture is useless because ignorance is protection. When the Italians realize Ray is telling the truth, they execute him anyway and dump his body on 145th Street as a message. But Frank doesn't panic or retaliate. He simply replaces Ray with another courier and continues operations without missing a single delivery. The mafia finally narrows their investigation to one name: Frank Lucas. Bumpy Johnson's former driver. A nobody who somehow built something that threatens everything they've constructed over 50 years. In July 1972, Frank receives an invitation to meet Dominic Catano, a mafia captain who controls Harlem distribution through intimidation and political corruption. The meeting takes place in an Italian restaurant in the Bronx. Frank arrives alone, unarmed, wearing his usual conservative suit. Catano sits surrounded by 4 soldiers whose jackets barely conceal their weapons. Catano doesn't waste time with pleasantries. You pay us $50,000 weekly. In exchange, you operate without interference. Your people stay safe. Your product moves freely. Everyone gets rich. This is how business is done. Frank's response rewrites 50 years of street law. I'm not interested. The restaurant goes silent. Catano's soldiers tense, hands moving toward weapons. But Catano recognizes something dangerous in Frank's calm refusal. This isn't bravado. This is calculation. You understand what you're saying no to? Catano asks, his voice dropping to a whisper that carries more threat than shouting. I understand perfectly, Frank replies. You're offering me the same deal you've offered everyone. Pay tribute. Accept my place. Rent power from you. But I don't rent, I own. Frank walks out alive only because the Italians are too stunned to shoot him. But war has been declared. Catano gives Frank 72 hours to reconsider. The implied threat is absolute: accept the partnership or Harlem burns. But Frank isn't worried about the Italians. Because while the mafia investigates from the streets, Detective Richie Roberts investigates from a photograph. That image of Frank in the chinchilla coat has become an obsession. Roberts has built a federal task force dedicated to answering one question: who is the black man sitting better than senators at the fight of the century? The mafia wants Frank's business. The government wants Frank's life. And for the first time, the Invisible King is fighting a war on 2 fronts without even knowing the Second Army has already breached the gates. Detective Richie Roberts sits in an unmarked van outside Frank's Teaneck mansion at 3 a.m., surrounded by surveillance photographs and cold coffee that tastes like obsession. For 18 months, one image has consumed his life: Frank Lucas in a $50,000 chinchilla coat at Madison Square Garden, sitting among senators and celebrities like royalty who crashed the wrong coronation. Roberts is an anomaly in the NYPD, an honest cop in a department so corrupt that officers sell evidence back to criminals before the paperwork dries. While his colleagues shake down dealers and pocket protection money, Roberts turned in $987,000 in unmarked cash found at a crime scene. His integrity makes him dangerous to men who've built empires on invisibility. Roberts doesn't have wiretaps or informants. The federal budget for his task force is minimal because nobody believes a black drug dealer could outsmart the Italian mafia. But Roberts has something more valuable than resources: methodical obsession. He studies that photograph like scripture, analyzing every detail. The coat costs more than most judges earn annually. The seats are reserved for American royalty. The confidence in Frank's posture suggests a man who doesn't fear being seen. This isn't a street hustler posing for cameras. This is an architect who made one fatal mistake. For 3 years, the investigation becomes a chess match between 2 masters of invisibility. Roberts maps Frank's empire one threat at a time, following his 15 brothers through Harlem, Newark, and the Bronx. He tracks their cars, noting patterns and routines. He watches stash houses from unmarked vehicles, documenting deliveries without making arrests. Because Roberts understands what his colleagues don't, catching street dealers is meaningless. He wants the source. Frank operates through compartmentalization and discipline, building a machine where torture is useless because ignorance is protection. Roberts operates through patience and pattern recognition. Neither man knows the other exists, but they're circling each other like sharks in dark water. Frank believes his system is perfect. No phones, no loose talk, family only. But perfection is fragile, requiring every component to operate flawlessly forever. Roberts only needs one component to fail once. That failure happens on a Tuesday afternoon in January 1975. A broken taillight. That's all it takes to dismantle an empire worth hundreds of millions. One of Frank's mid-level couriers gets pulled over on the Jersey Turnpike for the most routine violation imaginable. The nervous driver consents to a search. In the trunk, officers discover $300,000 in cash and 2 kilos of blue magic heroin. The courier doesn't talk, but the physical evidence screams. Roberts finally has probable cause. January 28, 1975. Dawn breaks cold and absolute over Teaneck. 70 federal agents surround Frank's home in military formation. They expect violence, weapons, chaos. Instead, they find Frank Lucas sitting calmly at his kitchen table in a silk robe, drinking coffee and reading the morning newspaper. He doesn't run or fight or look surprised. Because Frank has known since that photograph was taken that this moment was inevitable. Visibility is a death sentence in a business built on shadows. The search takes 6 hours. Agents tear through walls with systematic precision, finding $584,683 in cash hidden behind false panels. They find ledgers documenting millions in transactions. They find evidence of an operation that generated more revenue than most corporations. At federal court, the prosecutor lays out 70 years in prison with no possibility of parole. Frank is 44 years old. He will die behind bars, forgotten and erased. But then comes the impossible choice: cooperation. Become an informant. Trade knowledge for reduced time. Become a rat. Frank sits in his cell for 3 days, weighing honor against survival. Bumpy taught him that snitches die badly, that loyalty is the only currency that matters. But Bumpy also taught him to see angles others miss. Frank agrees to cooperate, but not on their terms, on his. He doesn't give up street dealers or mid-level distributors. He targets the system itself, identifying corrupt NIP detectives, federal agents, and judges who made his empire possible. He doesn't just snitch, he weaponizes cooperation to burn down the entire corrupt establishment. The question becomes impossible to answer. Is Frank saving himself, or is he saving the streets from the system that created him? November 1984. Federal Building, Lower Manhattan. Conference Room 4B. The air tastes like government coffee and fresh betrayal. 11 men sit around a mahogany table that has witnessed more confessions than a cathedral. 10 of them are cooperating witnesses who traded loyalty for immunity deals. One of them is Frank Lucas, the man who built an empire the mafia couldn't touch, then burned it down to save himself. The federal marshal plays waiter. Taking lunch orders like this is a business meeting instead of a theater of rats. Pastrami on rye. Chicken Caesar salad. Diet Coke with extra ice. Frank's former lieutenants, his blood relatives, his childhood friends, place their orders without meeting his eyes. Tommy's hands shake when he reaches for the menu. Eddie keeps checking the door like backup might walk through. Frank's own cousin stares at the wood grain like it contains answers to questions nobody asked. Frank orders nothing, just water, no ice, no lemon, just clarity. The prosecutors believe this is routine testimony. 10 informants cleaning up loose ends in cases already won. They don't understand they're watching the aftermath of the most devastating act of strategic cooperation in criminal history. Frank didn't just become an informant. He became a nuclear weapon disguised as a witness. The testimony begins with predictable mediocrity. The first witness spends 40 minutes describing low-level transactions that resulted in 3 arrests of nobodies selling dime bags in Newark. The second details a stash house operation prosecutors already shut down 2 years ago. The third, fourth, and fifth witnesses follow the same script. Small stories about small people committing small crimes. The prosecutors grow visibly frustrated. They assembled this panel expecting fireworks and receiving wet matches. Frank sits motionless, hands folded, expression unreadable. The prosecutors keep glancing at him, waiting for their legendary witness to perform. But Frank has already performed. Between 1975 and 1977, his testimony detonated the entire corrupt infrastructure protecting organized crime in New York. He identified 75 NIP detectives who took bribes and sold evidence. He exposed federal agents who facilitated shipments and warned dealers about raids. He dismantled the French connection by revealing the political machinery that allowed heroin to flow through diplomatic channels. His cooperation led to over 100 convictions, but not of street dealers, of the system itself. Frank weaponized cooperation to burn down the establishment that created him. While other snitches traded names of corner dealers for reduced sentences, Frank traded the architects. He understood the difference between snitching down and snitching up. One is cowardice, the other is warfare. These 10 men are just cleaning up crumbs from a feast Frank already served to prosecutors years ago. The dirty cops are indicted. The corrupt judges are disbarred. The protection network that made the drug trade possible is destroyed. Frank gave them the infrastructure while these witnesses offer only names. When it's finally Frank's turn to speak, he stands slowly. The room goes silent. Even the federal marshal stops pouring coffee. Frank looks at each man individually, letting the weight of his gaze settle like a verdict. "I let you order first," Frank says, his voice quiet but absolute, "because I wanted to see if any of you could look me in the eye while you did it. None of you could. That tells me everything about how long you'll survive on these streets." He doesn't yell or threaten. He delivers judgment. These aren't survivors, they're victims of their own fear who broke the code for nothing, selling their souls for pennies while Frank sold the system for his freedom. Frank Lucas served 5 years of a 70-year sentence, walking out of prison in 1981 alive and infamous. But the cost was absolute. His $1 million empire was seized. His family scattered. The streets that once worshipped him now debated his legacy. Frank died on May 30, 2019, at age 88. Broke, but breathing. The man whose operation generated over $1 billion at its peak ended life in a modest New Jersey apartment. The chinchilla coat that made him visible was sold decades ago to pay legal fees. But he died on his own terms, not in a cage or on a sidewalk, but as the last man standing in a game where everyone else was removed from the board. So we're left with the final question that haunts every legend who survives their own myth. In a game where everyone dies or goes to prison, was Frank Lucas the smartest player in history? Or did he just choose a different, slower, more painful way to lose?